of the Phantasms and of Narcissus, being an inquiry into the nature of the human mind, by Felipe Bautista. Preface. Narcissus detained himself, captured by his own reflection, nor could he depart his gaze from the reflection of himself that he perceived. In his remarkable A Treatise of Human Nature, the legendary Master Hume wrote that, "There is no question of importance, whose decision is not comprised in the science of man, and there is none which can be decided with any certainty before we become acquainted with that science." How may we come to understand anything at all unless we understand of itself human nature? 'Tis evident that all the sciences have a relation greater or less to human nature, and that however wide any of them may seem to run from it, they still return back by one passage or another, the Master Hume reminded us in his legendary Treatise of Human Nature. And although the nature and abuse of language has had a chief part in rendering speculation intricate and perplexed, and has occasioned innumerable errors and difficulties in almost all parts of knowledge, as the Master Berkeley reminded us in his legendary masterpiece, A Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge. Nevertheless, we ought to consider our terminology here, at the outset of our text. The first term I want to consider is information. What is information? When the great Alexander and his men in their quests conquered and captured territories even as far east as India, and even the legendary pyramids at Giza too, Alexander and his men marched and advanced in formation. They assumed some formation, that is. Now, sometimes that formation was well structured, as when Alexander and his men marched in unison with each other towards an enemy encampment, for instance. Other times it was more chaotic in the midst of battle, for instance. By information, I mean any impression or idea as it is an impression or idea in the mind, actively and actually, that is. I understand information to be of two kinds, therefore, of impressions and of ideas. The dependence of the present work on Hume's is unmistakable, and to that great genius the potential advancement of the sciences and of knowledge owe even their very name, I'd argue, though I digress. Narcissus could not detach himself from the sight of his own reflection, nor can the mind detach itself from its own impressions and ideas similarly. Some men have maintained that by means of thinking, the mind reflects, though Hume might suggest that by means of perceiving, the mind reflects for impressions, just as much as ideas are the mind's own reflections, as they manifest therein. The legendary Neville Goddard, in his text, Feeling is the Secret, maintained boldly that consciousness is the one and only reality, not figuratively but actually, so that when the mind beholds its own impressions and ideas, it finds itself in Narcissus's position, namely captured by its own reflections. Nobody will deny that a dove, in order to fly, needs her wings, and there are certain men who insist and maintain that the human mind and all its activity needs neurons electrically discharging in brains, viz. Needs matter, to occur. These men are called the materialists, incidentally. The materialist maintains that, when I have a thought in my own mind or an impression in my own perception, a certain neuron or sequence of neurons in my physical material brain has electrically discharged. I want to introduce two new terms here to the lexicon, namely, extramental and intramental. A third word, interrelational, will be discussed in due course. The latter, intramental, refers to information given in a mind, viz. To impressions and to ideas, namely to perceptions. The former, extramental, to information inferred by a mind by means of an idea, namely by means of the abstract idea of extramental substance, namely of matter. To subsist, though, neither as impression nor as idea in a mind. It appears intricate and perplexing, though I believe we may disentangle it. Many words will not be required to express the style and themes of that television program called The Twilight Zone. It being well known to everyone, I do not doubt this, that shows excellence and brilliance. Therefore, let us imagine our own episode of this fantastic television series. In our fictional episode of The Twilight Zone, all of a sudden, all brains disappear from the universe. All eyes, too, all noses also, even every sense organ of every possible creature altogether, so that suddenly, every creature that perceived and felt simply disappeared. No more creatures having feelings, no more creatures seeing colors, hearing sounds, nor having thoughts, etc. The materialist philosopher suggests that even though all brains and all eyes suddenly vanish from existence in the entire universe even, the red apple on my desk will continue to exist, unaffected. So too will the trees in the park continue to exist, and the clouds in the sky as well, all being completely unaffected by this sudden extinction, not being brains, not being eyes, nor noses, not sense organs, etc. Hume remarked that, "For if truth be at all within the reach of human capacity, 'tis certain it must lie very deep and abstruse, and to hope we shall arrive at it without pains, while the greatest geniuses have failed with the utmost pains, must certainly be esteemed sufficiently vain and presumptuous," again in that legendary treatise of human nature. Kant brilliantly introduced to mankind the noumenal and the phenomenal in his extraordinary and illustriously genius A Critique of Pure Reason. Nor do we mean to imply anything different with our own terms, extramental and intramental, than what this legendary master implied when he wrote down noumenal and phenomenal in his own extraordinary compositions. The non-colorblind man experiences one complex impression in his own mind, namely, a round red apple. Let us assume that his friend, a colorblind man, arrives and forthwith perceives the same red apple. The former man will say, "Most splendid of salutations to you, my remarkable friend who sees not colors on account of his color blindness, however." The latter shall retort, "Salutations to you as well, dearest friend, though I see not color. You, being non-color blind, perceive perfectly well various colors." The colorblind man experiences another complex impression in his own mind, namely, a round, not red apple. How do we account for this discrepancy? The materialist suggests, it's all a matter of the neurons in the eyes and in the brain of the organisms involved. One organism perceives the impression of a round and red apple, whereas another organism perceives the impression of a round and not red apple, because of how different neurons in their different brains electrically discharge, and how each, by their own unique set of eyes, detects a world at all. Let us return to our discussion of information. What do we mean by information? By information we mean an impression in the mind whilst it is an impression and an idea in the mind, similarly, whilst it is an idea. We see that our term information implies activity and only refers to perceptions whilst they are perceptions. When I perceive a tree when I go to the park, and later return home for the evening to retire into my chamber, let us say, that tree is no longer an impression in my mind. What is an impression? It is a perception. So, if I perceive a tree when I visit a park, let us say, whilst I perceive that tree, that is, whilst I actually look at it with my own eyes, that tree is an impression in my own mind, more precisely, is a complex impression in my own mind. The materialist will interject here and maintain that the tree is not an object in the mind, but an object outside the mind, not intramental but extramental, that is. If we return to our imaginary episode of The Twilight Zone, we discover that, according to the materialist philosopher, if all brains were annihilated all of a sudden, trees would still exist, being unaffected by this extinction, since they are not brains, nor eyes, nor sense organs, etc. Philosophers like the uncountably genius Bishop George Berkeley will maintain that a certain color, taste, smell, figure, and consistence having been observed to go together are accounted one distinct thing, signified by the name apple. Adding to this that, as to what is said of the absolute existence of unthinking things without any relation to their being perceived, that seems perfectly unintelligible. Their essay is percipi, nor is it possible they should have any existence out of the minds or thinking things which perceive them. In that genius master's incontestably remarkable masterwork, a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge. Berkeley and the materialist are in exact disagreement with each other. The materialist suggests, the apple subsists, though it be not an impression nor idea in my own mind, existing extramentally and therefore independently of mentation altogether. Berkeley, as we have seen, does not accept this position, nor does Hume either. Hume expressing, in his genius already mentioned treatise, that our senses offer not their impressions as the images of something distinct or independent and external is evident, because they convey to us nothing but a single perception, and never give us the least intimation of anything beyond. Book 1, Part 4, Section 2 of that legendary and unforgettable treatise of human nature. Nor is the materialist in agreement with the legendary physicist Max Planck, who remarked, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness." In an interview with The Observer, the 25th of January, 1931, adding that mind is the ultimate source of matter, in The Nature of Matter, a speech given in 1944 in Florence, Italy by that legendary intellectual. The incontestably genius Erwin Schrödinger even remarked that consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms, for consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else. The Observer, the 11th of January, 1931. Nor is idealism anything new. Even such notions were advanced in the Upanishads. The incontestably genius Hume discovered that he could not find his self. All he found, he noted, was a bundle of perceptions, impressions, and ideas. This returns us to Narcissus. Narcissus found himself caught up, entangled, perceiving his own reflection in the water. Hume is asking us to do the same. Hume suggests that, as the science of man is the only solid foundation for the other sciences, so the only solid foundation we can give to this science itself must be laid on experience and observation, in that legendary treatise. He is saying, in effect, stop and be Narcissus, study and examine your reflections. But he does not say this one man to another, but one mind to another. For, as we have already seen, and as the masterful Berkeley has reminded us, the vulgar opinion involves a contradiction. It is indeed an opinion strangely prevailing amongst men that houses, mountains, rivers, and in a word all sensible objects have an existence, natural or real, distinct from their being perceived by the understanding. But with how great an assurance and acquiescence soever this principle may be entertained in the world, yet whoever shall find in his heart to call it in question may, if I mistake not, perceive it to involve a manifest contradiction. For what are the forementioned objects but the things we perceive by sense? And what do we perceive besides our own ideas or sensations? And is it not plainly repugnant that any one of these, or any combination of them, should exist unperceived? In his legendary treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, that is. What did Hume say on the issue? He declared that, to begin with the senses, 'tis evident these faculties are incapable of giving rise to the notion of the continued existence of their objects, after they no longer appear to the senses, for that is a contradiction in terms, and supposes that the senses continue to operate, even after they have ceased all manner of operation. A Treatise of Human Nature, Book 1, Part 4, Section 2. The materialist, in other words, is being accused of engaging in contradiction by both Berkeley and Hume here, two staggering intellectuals because of whose remarkable and incomparable wisdom I would find at least valuable their propositions. The materialist does not want to hear it. He accepts it upon his own faith that all sensible objects have an existence, natural or real, distinct from their being perceived by the understanding. And though his position be identified as contradictory by genius thinkers, nevertheless, like a fanatic zealot in defense of his religion, he shuts his own eyes, seals his own ears, and will not tolerate the principles of logic and of reason. Contradiction or no, says our materialist, all sensible objects have an existence, natural or real, distinct from their being perceived by the understanding. I want to visit another word, phantasms. What do I mean by the word phantasms? I mean nothing different than what I mean when I say information, namely, perceptions, impressions, ideas in a mind. I.e., I am not in disagreement with Berkeley nor with Hume. I agree with Hume that, bereave matter of all its intelligible qualities, both primary and secondary, you in a manner annihilate it, and leave only a certain unknown, inexplicable something as the cause of our perceptions, a notion so imperfect that no skeptic will think it worth while to contend against it. In Section 12 of this master's legendary and sublime An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, I want to discuss why I find the mind a fascinating topic. After all, what is the subtitle of our present text? Of all the themes a man may have chosen to compose a treatise on, why the mind? Of all the possible fantastic topics and particularities which a man may have chosen from, why the mind? Is it not a worthy task to write a treatise of the conquests of Napoleon, of the pharaohs and their pyramids, of the galaxies and planets, etc.? Well, let us revisit what that great master George Berkeley pronounced. The vulgar opinion involves a contradiction. What is the vulgar opinion? The vulgar opinion is materialism, or at least naive realism. We have to discuss philosophy of mind. The philosophies of mind may be divided into three classes: realism, representational realism, and idealism. Realism suggests, like the materialist, that though all brains be annihilated from existence all of a sudden, trees and apples being real and not only perceptions in my own illusory mind created by my own real neurons in my own real brain, etc., will continue to exist, completely unaffected, not depending on brains, nor on minds, nor on eyes, nor on sense organs for their existence. Representational realism suggests that maybe the red of the apple will be taken away if my brain is removed. Maybe the red is only in my own mind, like the not red is there in the mind of the colorblind man. But certainly, something is there. Maybe an apple without a color, maybe neutrons and protons, maybe even little bitty strings vibrating, but something, let us recall, to begin with the senses, 'tis evident these faculties are incapable of giving rise to the notion of the continued existence of their objects after they no longer appear to the senses. For that is a contradiction in terms, and supposes that the senses continue to operate even after they have ceased all manner of operation, as an extraordinary genius once remarked in a certain unforgettable treatise of human nature. The idealist is Berkeley. As to what is said of the absolute existence of unthinking things without any relation to their being perceived, that seems perfectly unintelligible. Their essay is percipi, nor is it possible they should have any existence out of the minds or thinking things which perceive them, as we see it phrased in that legend's masterful A Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge. If I ingest LSD, no doubt I'll note my perception altered. First of all, I'll note forms begin to twist and wind and intermingle. Then I'll note a sense of what's been denoted the ego death. What is this latter? Narcissus could not bear the pain that accompanied his attempts to embrace his own reflection. He would grasp only waters, but never what he saw reflected on their surface. Though he longed to hold the beautiful creature he perceived reflected in the water, he found he never could, and was tormented by this. He admired the reflection, but it always managed to evade his grasp. And so, at last, he died, at the side of the pool of water where he saw his own face reflected back to his own gaze, having never departed from there, incapable of ever being pulled away from that remarkable young man reflected in that water. The story of Narcissus is a tragic one, for a young man dies desiring to hold himself, though never quite managing actually to do so. Hume wrote extensively concerning identity in his already mentioned Treatise of Human Nature. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. Book 1, Part 4, Section 6 of that legendary magnum opus. What is the ego's death? For who was crucified Christ? The mind is a kind of theater, where several perceptions successively make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. There is properly no simplicity in it at one time, nor identity in different. Whatever natural propension we may have to imagine that simplicity and identity, remarked the legendary Hume in his extraordinary Treatise of Human Nature. Again, Book 1, Part 4, Section 6 of that illustrious work. When I enter an elegant hall, with painted dome ceiling, classical in style, the materialist insists that those columns I perceive at the staircase's extremes when I descend those stairs and therefore perceive those columns, for the materialist, as I perceive them, are extramental. Hume suggests those columns are merely complex impressions in my mind. And we have already seen what Berkeley had to say. The vulgar opinion involves a contradiction. We have seen what has said Max Planck. Mind is the ultimate source of matter. And what Schrödinger declared, consciousness is absolutely fundamental. Most boldly of all, the mystic Neville Goddard wrote, "Consciousness is the one and only reality, not figuratively, but actually." Narcissus could not look away from his reflection, and "'Tis evident this reflection and premeditation would so disturb the operation of my natural principles as must render it impossible to form any just conclusion from the phenomenon. We must therefore glean up our experiments in this science from a cautious observation of human life, and take them as they appear in the common course of the world, by men's behavior in company, in affairs, and in their pleasures, in that master's treatise of human nature. I will agree with Hume. If truth be at all within the reach of human capacity, 'tis certain it must lie very deep and abstruse, and would esteem it a strong presumption against it, were it so very easy and obvious. See that legend's A Treatise of Human Nature. But, as the science of man is the only solid foundation for the other sciences, so the only solid foundation we can give to this science itself must be laid on experience and observation. Narcissus would have lived long if he had never known himself, so had said the seer, but the science of man is the only solid foundation for the other sciences. The only solid foundation we can give to this science itself must be laid on experience and observation. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. Genesis from the legendary King James Bible. Judge not that ye be not judged, once said a wise carpenter from Galilee. Judge not that ye be not judged, saith he. And in the fourth watch of the night Jesus went unto them, walking on the sea, it is said in a certain remarkable work. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, It is a spirit, and they cried out for fear. It is also therein writ. If we accept the great Bishop Berkeley's and the masterful brilliant Hume's principles that bereave matter of all its intelligible qualities, both primary and secondary, you in a manner annihilate it, and leave only a certain unknown, inexplicable something as the cause of our perceptions, a notion so imperfect that no skeptic will think it worthwhile to contend against it. That essay is Percipi. That is, we find that the waters upon which walked our Lord and Savior were only impressions in his own mind, namely complex impressions composed of simple impressions, with corresponding ideas being therewith formed in his intellect, both complex and simple ideas too, corresponding. Radical implications follow, certainly. The Master Berkeley believed that when he departed from his chamber, let us say to go for an afternoon promenade across a nearby park, his desk therein, in his chamber, that is, and the apple thereupon too, upon that desk, that is in that chamber anteriorly mentioned. The apple and his desk in his chamber continued to exist, though he be at the park, perceiving trees and a blue sky, not his apple on his desk, not being in his chamber naturally. Berkeley suggested that the unbounded mind of God perceived every atom and every electron and even every neuron and proton and subatomic particle and even every vast galaxy and even every galactic cluster and even every leaf on every tree and every apple on every desk in every chamber in the scope of the span of the whole of all existence altogether and entirely, viz. Though he himself, the legendary Bishop Berkeley, that is, perceived not his apple upon departing from his chamber, leaving his apple behind, therein, in that chamber that is, the omniscient mind of Almighty God kept the apple in existence by perceiving it by means of his extraordinary infinite mind, for, as to what is said of the absolute existence of unthinking things without any relation to their being perceived, that seems perfectly unintelligible, that is, the idea of God, as meaning an infinitely intelligent, wise, and good being, arises from reflecting on the operations of our own mind and augmenting without limit those qualities of goodness and wisdom, remarked the legendary Master Hume in his unforgettable inquiry concerning human understanding, section 2 of that extraordinary opus. Berkeley, without hesitation, will dissent, finding it inconceivable the notion that God might be abstract idea merely. Abstract idea merely, abstract idea merely, abstract idea merely? Nonsense, 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 Berkeley might retort. Echo found herself enchanted by and overwhelmingly enamored with Narcissus, but at last she turned into the sounds one hears in caves. It is indeed an opinion strangely prevailing amongst men that houses, mountains, rivers, and in a word, all sensible objects, have an existence, natural or real, distinct from their being perceived by the understanding. But, with how great an assurance and acquiescence soever this principle may be entertained in the world, yet whoever shall find in his heart to call it in question may, if I mistake not, perceive it to involve a manifest contradiction. He must surely be either very weak or very little acquainted with the sciences, who shall reject a truth that is capable of demonstration, for no other reason but because it is newly known, and contrary to the prejudices of mankind. Thus much I thought fit to premise in order to prevent, if possible, the hasty censures of a sort of men who are too apt to condemn an opinion before they rightly comprehend it. Felipe Bautista, Chicago, Illinois, the 12th of February, 2023. P.S. As wrote Oscar Wilde, there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all. All art is at once surface and symbol. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. Those who read the symbol do so at their peril. It is the spectator and not life that art really mirrors.